My name is Dr. Naomi Graber. I'm a musicologist here at UGA, and I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much to Richie for inviting me. I think my presentation is going to be a little bit different because I'm, first and foremost, I'm mostly a historian. So I'm going to be talking about some of these issues from a historical perspective. A lot of my recent research has to do with music and medicine, not necessarily from a sort of music therapy point of view, but from the point of view of how popular culture representations of people's relationship with the medical establishment appear in popular culture, and how music is part of the thing that shapes our ideas about what it means to be sick, about what it means to be well. Richie is currently in my seminar on the Mad Woman, and so quite a lot of my current research focuses on representations of mental illness and gender. Not really what I'm going to be talking about today, but I am going to be talking about the way music can help to articulate certain anxieties, certain cultural anxieties, especially in relationship to the medical establishment, at a particularly interesting moment in history, and that is World War II. Horror films are especially good at articulating anxieties. They tell us a lot about what is currently making a culture anxious. What are we worried about at this moment? So I want to talk about one particular film today that's called I Walked with a Zombie. It's from 1943. It's part of a series of films produced by this guy right here, Val Lewton. When we think of classic horror films, we often think of the classic horror monsters. We think of Frankenstein and we think of Dracula and all those kinds of films. Those films are all produced by the Universal Studio, mostly under Carl Laemmle Jr. By the late 1940s, those films had kind of run their course. They're starting to flag in popularity. And so the executives at a different movie studio, RKO, which isn't really around today, it's been absorbed into, I forget, Warner Brothers, I think. Warner Brothers, yeah. Said, okay, there's a market here for a new kind of horror film. And so what they did is they gave Val Lewton, who was hadn't really done any production before, but he had been in the business for a long time, they gave him a very small sum of money and a couple of different titles and said, have at it. And the first title they gave him was Cat People. But it actually turns out to be a really interesting film, and that one really does have to do with representations of mental illness, and I encourage you to watch it. This is the second film that he produced. The Val Lewton unit is really interesting because they update the horror formula from a kind of European 19th century or even medieval atmosphere to the present day. And they had absolutely no money. And so the only way that they could really scare people was through suggestion. And sound turns out to be a really important part of horror. Watch a horror film with the sound off and you'll realize it's just not scary at all. This is how I get through a lot of horror films, is I turn the sound way down. And we know this because of what Val Lewton did and what he contributed to the horror film. So before I tell you about this film, I want to talk a little bit about the context in which this film was made. One of the things Lewton figured out was that the audience for films in the early 1940s was largely women. This makes sense. It's World War II. Most of the men are off at war. Who is buying tickets to films? It's the women. And women are asked to take on a whole new set of roles in society during this period. We all are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, but it's not just factory roles. They are entering new professions. They are experiencing new things. They're on their own for the first time without a man who they've been taught will protect them. There's a lot of sequences in these films of women walking alone at night that would have been like terrifying to a 1940s woman, and are still terrifying to a lot of women. One of the professions that you see explode during this period is nursing. Tons and tons of women are enrolling in the Army Nurse Corps. And as they enroll in the Army Nurse Corps, they're not just experiencing new things in the context of the United States. They're experiencing new things abroad. A lot of nurses, when we think of World War II, we tend to focus on Europe, but a lot of nurses are needed actually more in the South Pacific. And so we're talking new climates, new, this is a very different physical world. It's sort of jungly. It's beautiful, but it's so strange, and it seems to hide all of these very different dangers, insects, diseases that have been a part of Indigenous communities' lives for a very long time, but aren't really familiar to nurses who are middle-class white women from, the United States. So malaria, dysentery, these are just going through the armed forces like you would not believe. I have this great quote from a nurse who talks about an ulcerative skin condition called jungle rot, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. She said that her fellow nurse was covered from head to foot and looked like something out of Mars, with all of these different sores. Not only that, they are experiencing, they're seeing just the general fallout of war, and it's horrible. They're seeing disfigured soldiers, they're seeing wounded soldiers who are experiencing all sorts of mental health conditions. And I have this really wonderful quote, and this is a little bit graphic, but you'll see why it relates in just a second. This is a nurse saying about some of the soldiers in her unit. Some had their nose blown off. Some had no jaw. Some were sans chin, nose, and jaw. A few had a forehead only left. These were the living dead, who will spend the rest of their lives in a closed section of some stateside hospitals. What really stuck out to me with that was the living dead. And so you can see why zombie movies in particular might start to show up in this world. Not only are they encountering new environments, new diseases, they're encountering new people. A lot of they're working alongside Indigenous communities. Some of these Indigenous communities, they're orderlies in the hospitals. They are encountering very different ways of life. That's gotta be really, really anxiety provoking for a lot of these very sheltered white women. Not only that, they're facing diseases that they don't know how to cure. And sometimes the Indigenous populations do know how to cure them. And that looks like magic to them, possibly even black magic. And it's they're worried about what they're doing to their patients. Are they doing something demonic to their patients? It's a very anxiety-provoking time. But it's not just Indigenous communities that they are encountering. They're also encountering Black nurses. There's a whole bunch of Black women who start enrolling in nursing programs during this time, and this causes all kinds of tension. If you read some of the journals, nursing journals from this time, you see white women, saying, "Oh God, I won't be part of this program." There's Black women there, and they have to work through that. So as part of their encounters with Black and brown communities, white women are just now learning about some of the historical injustices that these communities have faced. They're being really faced with racism and colonialism for the first time. And you can imagine that could be extraordinarily disturbing. And so all of these themes come out in this film, I Walked with a Zombie. So here are our main characters. Our Our protagonist is this woman right here, Betsy Connell, played by Frances Dee. She is a nurse. And so this is Hollywood, so we don't directly address things. Everything's kind of transmuted into this sort of dreamlike thing. So she's not going to the South Pacific. She's going to an island called St. Sebastian, which doesn't exist, but it's very obviously a stand-in for Haiti. And we know that for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. Her job is to tend to this woman here, Jessica Holland. Jessica Holland is our zombie. She is the living dead. We don't know what happened to her at the beginning of the film. All we know is that she's catatonic. And Betsy is supposed to be sort of her companion. Jessica Holland is married to Paul Holland, who runs a kind of manor house, very obviously an old plantation. Paul Holland's mother is Mrs. Rand. And it comes out over the course of the film. So what happens is that Betsy tries to cure Jessica through kind of average, normal Western medical means. It doesn't work. They try all sorts of crazy treatments. And so finally, Betsy says, okay, we're going to talk to the indigenous Black community here and see if they can do anything for Jessica. So she journeys into the heart of the Black community. It's called the Home Fort. And at the heart of the Black community, she finds Mrs. Rand, who has been administering medical care to this community. It turns out that Mrs. Rand has employed voodoo magic to turn Jessica into a zombie because Jessica was unfaithful to Paul. And in the end, Jessica dies, and Betsy and Paul end up together because it's the 1940s. But all of these different themes come to play in this film, especially the themes of kind of the discovery of injustice. You know, the thing that really haunts this community is the slave trade. And that's made very explicit in the film. And the anxiety about what happens when white people start to mess with what they see as possibly demonic indigenous practices. So, and the music is how we know this. The music is what makes this theme clear. In order to kind of lend a touch of authenticity to this film, Luton hired a man named Leroy Antoine, who was a Haitian ethnomusicologist. He had published this book of Haitian chants, and I know he was on set at some point. I feel he's in the film, but he's not credited. But he is credited as a musical consultant. And he worked very closely with Roy Webb, who was the kind of general music composer. And Webb and Antoine, really the score should be credited to both of them, but it's not because of, Hollywood practices of the time, wove in some of these Haitian chants into the score as a way to kind of get at some of these anxieties. So this is the very opening of the picture. It's going to sound like a typical kind of 1940s opening of a film. You're going to get a kind of fanfare sound, and then you're going to get a kind of lilting, softer, more romantic motive. This living dead or possessed. It's truly coincidental. Sounds like a normal 1940s film. Well, pretty early on, it's revealed that that fanfare, bum 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 bum, is actually a Haitian chant. So when Betsy is coming to the island, she's on a ship, and she hears the people on the boat singing. And then she's sort of musing to herself about how beautiful it is, and then Paul is going to come in and kind of disabuse her of that notion. And this is going to articulate the main themes of the film, that it's beautiful, but it's hiding something dark. It's hiding something disturbing.
Only a few days before I met Mr. Holland and people. We boarded the boat to St. Sebastian. It's all just as I imagined it. Looked at those great glowing stars, and felt the warm wind on my cheek. I breathed deep. Every bit of me inside myself said, "Oh, beautiful."
It's not beautiful.
You read my thoughts, Mr. Holland.
Easy enough to read the thoughts of a newcomer. Everything seems beautiful because you don't understand. Those flying fish, they're not eating to dry. They're jumping in terror. Bigger fish want to eat them. That luminous water takes its gleam from millions of tiny dead bodies. The glitter of putrescence. There's no beauty here, only death and decay.
You can't really believe.
So just as the sea seems beautiful, but it's really hiding, death, decay, that sort of thing, and you can call to mind the middle passage here, which I think this is very much a direct reference to. The average Hollywood fanfare turns out to be a black melody. It's built on the bones of blackness. And this is a theme that comes up throughout the film. So here is the theme for Fort Holland, which is the old plantation. And it's the same sort of romantic tune that you heard in the opening melody.
When the breeze seemed strangely dreamlike, the garden had light and soul. I was to know all of this planning to that great house. Love will fall, according to what happened there.
Okay? The statue is going to be important. You'll find out more about him in a second. So it turns out this too is based on Haitian music. So as I said, Betsy takes Jessica to the heart of the indigenous community. Again, it's not technically Haiti, it's St. Sebastian. But there are some very obvious similarities between what the indigenous community is singing and what you just heard. So this is a chant called Olegba. Okay. There's one more called Walena Guinen. That's what this sounds like.
This woman is ill.
So here's my transcription of those three melodies. This is the Fort Holland theme. Here's Olegba, here's Walena Guinen. And you can see they have this, for those of you who read music, you can see they have this very similar figure of a rising triad and falling down a step. Here, again, right here, here it is again. And so, again, we have literally now the plantation this time is built on the fragments of blackness, is built on the fragments of black music. And lest this appear to esoteric and, not really audible to the average ear, the film actually spells this out at some point.
Why would they cry?
I'm not sure I can make you understand. You know what this is?
Figure of Saint Sebastian.
Yes. It was once the lineage of a slave ship. That's where our people came from. The mystery and pain of slavery. For generations they wound life with earth. That's why they still weep when a child is born and they bury it veil. I told you, Miss Connell, this is a sad place.
So in this film, we find a female nurse confronting somebody who is wounded in a way that she doesn't understand in a place that appears beautiful, but is hiding all sorts of dark secrets. In order to cure this person, she begins to dabble in indigenous medical practices. It turns out that a white person using those indigenous medical practices is disastrous. Jessica is the zombie. And it's actually up to the indigenous community to kind of put it right by kind of resetting order, which I'm not going to show for time's sake. Throughout this, she's coming face to face with the injustices of Western culture. And so this is how Val Lewton produced horror films and produced Anxiety, is that it wasn't about jump scares and it wasn't about monsters. I mean, Jessica's not especially scary when you look at her. I mean, there's like one or two shots where she's sort of menacing, but she's not gross the way that, say, Frankenstein would have appeared gross. It's through suggestion. It's through narrative. And in the end, it turns out that kind of the islanders and Saint Sebastian get the last word. So this is the final shot of the movie. This is what you're left with. Which I think is a pretty powerful shot. I mean, this is a fairly extraordinary movie for 1943. This is not the sort of thing that you see in most mainstream films in 1943. This is a B film. It's unclear. It's a little bit unclear to me whether it's a B film or not. I think it's a B film, which meant that it had a little bit more latitude. And it's unclear to me if a film like this would have made it past the censors if it was an A film, because it is so blatant, at least for 1943. But this is how movies can surface anxiety, and how music can help elucidate those themes if you're listening closely enough. Now, I do want to say, this is not really an anti-racist film, especially by the standards of 2024. We have a lot of the same tropes of primitive Black people, of primitive indigenous cultures. A lot of the horror comes from kind of watching these strange rituals. Is it an anti-racist movie in 1943? It's a little bit of a different question. You could definitely take away from this a kind of anti-miscegenation message that it's just not good that these two cultures should mix, they should stay separate. But that's not the only message you can take away from them. One of the powers of popular culture is that it can start conversations. And as we heard in the previous panel, everybody's going to take away something different. So I think of this film as kind of a Rorschach test. You take away from this film what you bring to it. And it's probably going to reinforce whatever you believed before, more than change anybody's mind. But it is still a fascinating film and a fascinating depiction of the anxieties around medicine, around well-being that are swirling among white women communities in World War II. So thank you so much for your time. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you so much for that. A couple of questions. We have about 2 minutes.
I don't really get horror movies, so this is really interesting, and I'm thinking about, for the intended audience, they have this experience, but then they walk back out into a world that's just like white supremacy, unchallenged. So what is actually happening there? What is this mental experience?
I mean, so you say you don't really get horror movies. I didn't either until I started kind of sort of watching them in a different way. I have an anxiety disorder. It's been part of my life for a very long time. A lot of people think of horror movies as cathartic, as you go in and you release a bunch of your fear, blah 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 blah. So I have a slightly different experience with horror movies, which is that I'm spending a lot of time and energy kind of keeping my anxiety under control. When I'm watching a horror movie, I can release that. And so that is kind of what I expect is going on here, is that these women are just beginning to, because this is a film aimed at white women. That's one of the reasons that I'm hesitant to call it an anti-racist movie. Black women probably, and black people in general, probably had a very different response to this film. But they are becoming aware of it on some level. And this film kind of gives them space to process that. That would be my guess, because they are coming into contact with black women for the first time. They are coming, if they're in the South Pacific, they are coming into contact with indigenous communities and indigenous histories for the first time. So that would be my guess. It's really hard to tell. Getting a sense, especially of historical women's response to these things, is really difficult because most of the reviews are still written by them. So I hope that answered your question.
It's very interesting. Alongside the hopeless kind of neo-colonial atmosphere of this film, it is at a time when certain buds are coming.
Yes.
Like 3 or 4 years before Acorreu do Brasil, the new national anthem in Brazil said, "I can't wait for the black girl on the mountains come and drink with me." A desire for a just society. And also, it was 5 years before Midnight Children and the British gave India back, and colonial powers started, to do what they should have done long before. And they did it very badly, of course.
Oh, yes.
But nevertheless, they did it, and that's better they did it than they didn't do it. So in a sense, I sense that there are little buds here of bursting. The comment about music, very interesting. I mean, here, how interesting horror movies have been the transporters of so much interesting music. So they actually have bothered to go to a proper Haiti singer and transcribe those things in collaboration. That's the start. And the other amazing thing is in the British horror music industry, the Hammer horror films.
Yeah, which are about 15 years later.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is a very good friend of mine was one of Britain's first women modernist composers, Elizabeth Lutyens, a wonderful composer and a great creative spirit, who had a wonderful rainbow family, by the way. She was a very great spirit. But she couldn't get her work played as a big, and everyone's out, where would it be played? On Hammer horror movies, of course. We don't want this music in proper concert halls, but for the opening and closing of coffins, that's great. Let's have Elizabeth's music. So it's an interesting transporter of those things. Yeah,
I mean, one of the ways that people, that the sort of general public, whatever that means, comes into contact with avant-garde music is through film. And especially horror film. I mean, the famous, The Shining uses like a ton of Ligeti and a ton of Penderecki, and some of the more difficult Bartók stuff. And that's another female composer, Wendy Carlos, who's also kind of behind the scenes doing a lot of the sound work for that film. But that sort of, I think, speaks to what you said about, this is just before we're starting to see, a variety of movements to kind of relinquish colonial holdings. And I can't help but think that the kind of cultural contact that occurred during World War II and the, extreme anxieties those provoked probably did play a role. And you see that kind of coming out in these films.
Thank you so much for the most fascinating